Hello, everyone. Yay. Hello, everyone. My name is Stacey Knoell. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission and the President of the Board of the Kansas Black Leadership Council. I want to take a second to welcome everyone to our webinar where we're going to go over our results from our legislative survey that we have been pushing out for the last couple of months. If we can start that slide presentation. Well, while that slide's coming up, I will take a second to introduce briefly everyone who's on the screen with me, and we'll do longer introductions later. I want to start with Bonita Gooch, who is the editor-in-chief of the Community Voice newspaper. She's also on the board of KBLC. John Nave, who's also on the board of KBLC. He's the executive vice president of the AFL-CIO. Brooklynne Mosley is also on our KBLC board. She works with GPS Impact and is a political advisor around the state. Mark McCormick, who is a policy director at, communications director at the ACLU, and also the chair of the African American Affairs Commission. And then Donnavan Dillon, who joins us as your community organizer for Loud Light, that works specifically with voting rights in the younger populations in college. Okay, so I will introduce everyone a little more length later. We will talk about, yes, Noreen has put this in the chat. The audience, if you have questions as we're moving through, feel free to put those in the chat, and then the panelists will be able to see them. If you have a question as the person is talking, we'll try to ask the question as the person is talking. If not, we can perhaps have some time at the end to do questions. So our agenda, I will talk a little bit about the history of the KBLC, the Black Leadership Council, and then we'll go over the survey results, including who took the survey, and then we will focus in on 5 areas that the survey covered, specifically housing, Medicaid expansion, medical marijuana, criminal justice reform, and voting rights. And so we have people here, that's why the group that's here is talking about those. Next slide. The Kansas Black Leadership Council is an organization, it's a 501c3 that is a statewide organization that actually has been around for quite some time. You can go to the next slide. And our mission, you can read it there, is to focus on advancing the interests of the African American community statewide. We're really lucky here to have Bonita Gooch on this particular call. She was one of the founding members of KBLC, along with Representative Gail Finney, who we lost a couple of years, recently here, and Kenya Cox at the time, she was the executive director of the African American Affairs Commission and also works with the state convention of the NAACP. Next slide. Historically, KBLC has been focused on, the origination of KBLC was to focus on advocacy and in order to have more Black people involved in state legislature, shaping policy that impacts our community, and really bringing more Black people to the legislature to really have our voices be known. One of the ways that was really pushed forth was through Black Legislative Day and a Black Legislative Agenda. That has continued to survive even to this day. And indeed, we just recently had our Black Legislative Day in February. And one of the things we did was push out this survey. And so we're sort of closing the loop and going over the results of the survey. Next slide. KBLC focuses on 4 specific areas: research, resources, civic engagement, and advocacy. Research, really, this survey is part of the research, really asking the community what's important to us. Resources, we have served as fiscal sponsors for other 501c3s, smaller agencies that are doing the work really at the ground level. And then civic engagement and advocacy, that's really what kind of our bread and butter between the Black Legislative Day. And then also we are going to do a series of leadership brunches around the state. And we'll talk over that a little later on. Next slide, please. So the survey results, this is why we're here this evening. Fantastic. Next slide. About the survey, it was entirely a digital survey. It was pushed out online. We had QR codes. We pushed it out at in-person events. I know John handed it out at the Living the Dream. I handed it out at Martin Luther King events. We had it on all kinds of social media, and multiple counties around the state were represented. Over 160 people responded, and so those are the results we're going over today. Next slide. And then who did it? Next slide. I want to take a moment here to point out these gorgeous slides because this is not my wheelhouse. Sheila Ellis Glasper and Amaya Thomas of SEG Media put a lot of these slides together. And I also want to say a special thank you to Noreen Spears, who is, she's hidden here, but without her technical support, you would be looking at just a blank screen. Let's just put it that way. So we can see that more women answered the survey than men. And then, but I think we had a really nice spread of age groups of people who responded to this. So I think it's a nice split amongst the age groups. Always, everyone's trying to reach that 19 to 24 demographic. That's always our one of our focuses, is try to reach the younger people. Okay, next slide. This one actually warmed my heart. Of the people who responded, 98% of us were registered to vote. That is fantastic. And that 80% of them voted in municipal primary elections, and they're planning to vote in the general election. This is a wonderful slide, in my opinion, because it is so important that we as a community train ourselves to vote in every election, every year, especially these municipal elections. So important. So thank you for that. Next slide. And then this last one was just one that's important to everyone who pays attention to the Black community, this question of how do you get your information? We see that social media is the dominant way that people get information. The Community Voice newspaper was also an important way that people get information. So thank you for the work you do, Bonita, Gooch, with that. And that Facebook and Instagram sort of rule the roost in terms of how information reaches the Black community. So that was important for us to know on our side. So as we get information out to the Black community, that's probably the channels we're going to use. Okay, next slide. So now we're getting into the actual survey results themselves. I want to take a second to have a little more of an introduction of the people we have on the screen today. And Brooklynne Mosley is going to be talking first about housing. Brooklynne, get my screen here, is a 10-year veteran of the United States Air Force. So thank you for your service, with a total of 8 deployments, accumulating over 3,000 flight hours and combat flight hours. After the Air Force, she moved to Lawrence, Kansas to attend the University of Kansas. She's now an experienced campaign operative, having worked on 3 presidential campaigns, 3 governor's races, and countless competitive races up and down the ballot. John Nave is the vice president of the Kansas AFL-CIO since 2018 and assists in the organization work of the AFL-CIO. John attended Washburn University and has served as a former Topeka City Council member. He graduated from the leadership of Greater Topeka and the National Leadership Development Training Program and the National Institute of Corrections. John is a standing board member of the Living the Dream Incorporated, a past board member of the American Red Cross, and a volunteer center of Topeka. He has also been confirmed by the governor and had served on the, I can't get it out, Governor Kelly's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. Mark McCormick joined the ACLU Kansas in 2018 and served as the Director of Strategic Communications. In 2022, he moved to the current position as the Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives. Previously, he served as the Executive Director of the Kansas African American Museum in Wichita, Kansas. Mark is a New York Times bestselling author with over 20 years experience as a reporter, editor, and columnist. Donnavan Dillon is the community organizer with Loud Light. In his time with Loud Light, Donnavan has worked extensively with campus organizations and aims to use those skills to create community partnerships around civic engagement. Donnavan particularly enjoys organizations within the LGBTQ and Black communities across Kansas. And through programming and events, Donnavan hopes to mobilize the next generation of young Kansans to bring forward substantive change in Kansas. Okay, so here we go. Next slide. The survey questions themselves. One more slide. And I will turn this over to Brooklynne, who will take it from here. Brooklynne, thank you.
All right. So for those of you who for those of you who completed the survey, you were asked the questions about a lot of different subject matters that were really important to our community in Kansas. Housing came as the strongest one. We also asked about Medicaid, criminal justice reform, voting rights, payday lending, which was a hot topic, definitely within like the last decade, especially in the northeast corner of our state, environmental justice, cannabis reform, tax reform, and then also local control. But as Stacey mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on 5 issues. So let's go to the next slide and let's talk about housing. So one of the things in housing that came up a lot was people really agreed on affordable housing. So So Kansas currently has an affordable housing shortfall of over 50K housing for low and extremely low income families. So what that means is that basically these are families of a family of four making $28,000 as actually extremely low, because you need basically about $38,000 to be able to rent a 2-bedroom house, a 2-bedroom apartment in our state. So with our minimum, if you marry our minimum wage, with that, there's no place in the state where our minimum wage, statewide minimum wage actually meets that. And then also in 2023, the Kansas legislature invested $62 million to address housing, but mostly in rural communities. So like that's where we come in, because we need to be our best advocates. So next slide. Here are the things that were most important to people when they completed this survey for housing. They said state-funded affordable housing ownership programs. So renters rent to own. So like I live in Douglas County. We have tenants to homeowners, and I think we have that in multiple counties across the state. But we have a shortfall of just those housing. There's not enough. The people who need that program and the amount of the housing inventory just is not meeting. There's a huge gap there. Another thing is just state dollars to incentivize housing development that is affordable housing. I live in the northeast part of the state, and so I actually live in downtown, and I am looking at one of our gentrification towers out of my front door window of apartments, where we look and say, based off of like the amount of industry we have and how much people make, we know that the average person cannot afford that. So we don't have a problem with like houses being built. We have a problem with the wrong type of homes being built to meet the needs of our community, especially across the state. When you go back and you think about what that minimum wage is. And then also expanding down payment assistance program was really critical. As someone who I think Stacey mentioned, I was in the service, I have the GI Bill. That is going to be my entry into home ownership whenever I stop being super picky about home ownership. But like not everyone has that opportunity. So we definitely need to continue to be pressing on expanding those programs. And then also just banning discrimination when it comes to source of income. So for anyone who doesn't know what source of income is, there are a lot of agencies, especially going back to that number for low income and extreme low income families. I know in Douglas County, I sit on the board for United Way, Cobb Valley. And one of the things that we have is that we have an abundance of vouchers that we can give out, but we do not have landlords who actually rent out to folks because they care about source of income. And and so working on making sure that we get rid of some of that discriminatory policy that makes it where we have housing, we have a way to pay for someone to have housing, just making sure that they're actually able to get the housing. They're not discriminated about where that money's coming from, because you're going to get paid, you're going to get paid. And now I am going to kick it to the next slide, which I believe is going to be, actually, I'll just kick it to Stacey and let Stacey introduce the next speaker.
All right, John Nave is going to come up and talk about Medicaid expansion. If for people who are watching, if you have questions, you can put them into the chat, and I and the panelists will see your questions. So if you have questions that you want to submit, feel free to do so. John.
Oh, good evening, everybody. Well, one of the biggest push for law at the Capitol was Medicaid expansion. And, roughly 80% of the citizens across Kansas want Medicaid expansion. We haven't been able to have hearings on it in the past, but there was some hearings on it, and I'll go into that in a little bit later. But what Medicaid expansion would do was it would cover over 152,000 Kansans would be covered. The state has lost out up to, as of now, close to $7 billion. That's what it'd be, $7 billion from our federal dollars that leave the state and that don't come back. We would like to get that money back. And to have Medicaid expansion, that would cover working families for under $11,000 yearly income, okay? But there also would be some work requirements with exceptions, such as people with disabilities, caregivers, veterans, full-time students, former foster kids. And then would also add a surcharge for hospitals. Costs to the state would be offset through the Affordable Care Act. You know, 68% of the Kansans, 51% of the Republicans, and 83% of business owners support the Medicaid expansion. This state wants it, but our elected leaders continue to stand still. One of the things that I say, though, is there is hope. One of our good senators will be meeting with, on the Senate floor, will call for a vote to bring Medicaid expansion to the floor. So there is hope. But what I say is for all of you listening, to call your state senator and support that vote to bring it to the floor to help change many of the working families around the state. You know, I see and meet with working families all across the state. What we have to do is continue the push. You know, there has been meetings held this year. Earlier in March, there was a meeting held. They had a Senate joint House hearing in March, and then there was a House hearing on it in committee. But of course, it died. But if we continue to push and call those elected officials, we can get it done. But it's going to take everybody to do that. And I'll end there. Now, on this next slide, I'm sorry, it shows 89.5% of the people want Medicaid expansion. And that was one of our biggest issues from our survey.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question in the chat. Thank you. And again, if anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat and we can see those. The question is, why are Republican legislators fighting Medicaid expansion? And I know a lot of us on this call have paid attention to the issue. So John, or if anyone else.
They have fought because they are dug in. They know they don't want to see this governor take a win for all Kansans, and not whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent. They just don't want to see her get a win, and it's political. You know, she's fought tirelessly for it, and there's a lot of Republicans that quietly behind closed doors want it, but they don't have the courage to stand up and say, let's give this a vote. So we're hoping, that's why it's important for people to call their legislators and tell them we want Medicaid expansion on that floor in the House and in the Senate, and bring it to a vote.
Donnavan, I thought I saw a hand go up.
I mean, I think John hit it pretty much perfectly on the head. I think we've just gotten with this particular issue, it's just political theater. A lot of Republicans don't want to see Governor Kelly have such a major win. I think that's also why we're kind of at the same issue with medical marijuana, which will be talked about later. But it's really unfortunate, especially in a lot of like rural Republican districts where you see hospital closures, which Medicaid expansion could have a very positive effect on. And it's very unfortunate that that's the case, but I would say there's wide consensus that that's what we're dealing with.
Right. There was a comment in the chat that's because it used to be called Obamacare. So that, you know, that probably has something to do with it. Okay. Thank you very much. And again, so if there's questions that in the audience, please, by all means, you can put those in the chat and we can see those. Especially if there's questions about, we went through housing, and I didn't want to, you know, shortchange, you know, if there's any questions about housing. Brooklynne made a lot of good points about the short, just there's not necessarily a shortage of stock, but there's shortage of people who are willing to rent. So, but we will continue to move on. So next slide, please. Marijuana reform. So Miss Bonita Gooch.
That's me. Okay. Although we're a couple days late, happy 420 Day. And for those who don't know, who 420 Day is a National Weed Day, and the Community Voice held a forum similar to this on that day to discuss, you know, what would it take to get a bill passed that is advantageous to our community, through the legislature. As you all know, Kansas is one of the few states that has no kind of legalized marijuana, medical or recreational. And so we are way behind. And Glenda, before you ask, why won't they pass it? I'm going to tell you. One of the things we came up with, the biggest problem to this is Ty Masterson. Can I say his name? Who is president of the Senate. And out of our meeting on 420, we came up with some steps that we thought were important to getting a bill that was effective for us. And one for getting any kind of bill is getting to Ty Masterson, because he's the one that controls it and refuses to put it on the floor. One time we've had one bill that has made it to the floor and got it all the way to a vote on the House, and he would not bring it up in the Senate. So one thing is vote a legislature in that will support it. And Ty Masterson is one that really just needs to go, because he's holding up Medicaid expansion as well as this medical marijuana. But things that are important to get in a bill, we talked about that. Well, first, one thing we said is more important to have no bill than a bill that's a bad bill. So we're really hoping to get a bill that speaks. And every year that they don't pass a bill, I'm kind of like, well, thank goodness, because there have not been a lot of good bills that have been advantageous to our community. So some of the things that we talked about that would be important to see, and these were some of the things that also came out in the survey. The right to grow wasn't one, but medical marijuana can be awful expensive, and all of our people don't have the money. And so the right to be able to grow some of your own small amount is a good one that a lot of people thought was important. That's one that's passed in the Missouri legislature. Affordable licensing, and one of the big things is, we paid the price of this on the war on drugs, and now that it's legal, can our community make any of this money now that it's going to be an economic boom, a legal economic boom? Can we make any of the money? And so affordable licensing with some, and we say at least a 15% set aside for minority communities and communities impacted by the war on drugs would be good to include in any bill. Diverse consumption methods. The last bill, this year, there were two bills that kind of really got some work. One that still kind of might come back up, but we don't think it's going to get passed. But they said that neither of them allowed you to smoke marijuana. I think one of them said you can only do gummies. This last bill had just, you could take a pill or an ointment. And I think people are saying they have more choices and ways that they would like to consume. And the other thing that's very important that came out of our survey too is sentencing reform, so that that people who are already been sentenced may get some kind of abatement on their sentence. People who have served their times can get an expungement of their sentence, and sentencing reform for those who would still not be doing things quite legally. And this is going to be a problem. If we can't participate in the system legally, we may still be participating in it, not necessarily as legally. And that if it's not that bad of a crime, maybe we can get the sentences reduced. But one of the big things we just commented is that our community has not been actively involved in speaking up on this issue. And it's been driven by a lot of organizations, none of which involved any of us. And that it's very important that between now and the start of the 2025 session, that we really get actively involved in speaking up on this issue and collaborating with organizations who are effectively doing so, and see if we can partner with them to get our position heard on this. So that, again, when we started the KBLC years ago, is ask for something. If you don't get mad. If you don't ask for something, don't get mad and you don't get it. So that it's very important that we speak up on this issue and ask for something. I like to see.
There's a couple of questions in the chat
okay.
as well. So I wanted, while you still had some time left, one is about the expungement. Are there movements to expunge now?
This last bill, no. A lot of the bill that I understand that made it to the floor several years ago, made it past the floor to the House, had some really good things in it, like expungement and some things of that sort. But the last couple of bills haven't. A number of the bills had something about 15% set aside for minorities and underserved communities. These last bills did not have that in there. So again, if they don't believe we they can get away with not giving us anything or taking us, they will. So we've got to speak up, people. This is really going to finally happen sometime here soon.
Right.
And so we've got to speak up.
I know there was a conference committee, not conference committee, a special committee over the summer, and KAAAC provided testimony. And that was the only thing we said. If you're going to do this, you need to deal with expungement. There have been separate bills dealing with expungement of records, and they can't get hearings. They can't get passed. There's a whole set of bills dealing with clean slate, this idea of expunging records, and they're not getting worked. They're not getting seen.
Yeah, I'm
Next
hearing
question.
not that much in favor of that, but we still doesn't mean we don't ask.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then the next question, how do we control illegal marijuana or the loss of control amongst youth, right? So dealing with, well, let's just go with that, because for time's sake, how would we control illegal marijuana?
I don't know. There's still going to be illegal marijuana, people. It is. I mean, it just is. and so, but the point is, maybe the sentences aren't as high for legal marijuana, because I mean, it's just a life. I mean, there's still people who want to sell all sorts of drugs illegally, although some of them are legal, like opioids and things of that sort are legal, but there's people selling them, and we're not going to get rid of that again. So can we get some of us to be able to make some economics and find a way to work our way into the system? That would be the best we could hope for. But there's going to be somebody who always is going to sell it underground, and that's just a fact.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, I think on that note, when you decriminalize drugs, especially in the instance of marijuana, you can really focus on that care piece, because I think, as our history has shown, criminalization, over policing is not the solution to the issue of young people doing drugs or turning to do drugs. And I think, especially if we open ourselves up to the economic opportunity, we can actually invest into those issues rather than just throwing more Black and brown people in jail.
And this is Brooklynne. I'm gonna add to that. I think that when you really if that's an education thing, like multiple states have legalized cannabis across this country. Like Miss Bonita said, we are the only state that does not have any form of legalized cannabis usage. So that's an education piece. I recently worked in a state that legalized cannabis when I worked a governor's race in the Northeast. They really focused on education. And then when you also make something where it is widely around, it no longer becomes this thing that's like edgy anymore. So just like alcohol is legal and alcohol kills way more people than cannabis ever has, there's just the education piece. So youth is always going to have access to things that we don't want them to have access to. It is our job as a community to educate them on making sure that they are being safe and not doing something that is going to be detrimental to their future.
Good conversation. But let's move to our next topic. Next slide, please. Oh, this was.
Oh, okay. These are just some of the points, and I think I mentioned them, that we said, that people said 74.3% want to see sentences reduced for those who are incarcerated because of activities related to marijuana possession. 59% wanted medical marijuana legalized for the health benefits, and 51.4% want to ensure that there's equitable distributions of licenses to grow and distribute marijuana. And the only one on the other side that's new is a very small percentage were pushing for recreational marijuana. I think most people would be happy to get anything in Kansas, and we know that's going to start with medical.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay, Mark McCormick.
It was interesting. If you look at the results here, they were resounding. 96.9% of respondents either strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that we need criminal justice reform. Not a single respondent disagreed with that at all. I did want to drill down on a couple of the issues. It was interesting to see that police accountability ranked so high among respondents. And, in the aftermath of O.J. Simpson's passing, I was thinking about Johnny Cochran and something that he said during that trial that always stayed with me. He was making the point during the trial that the traffic officer who stops you is the single most powerful person in the criminal justice system. They could take your life on the spot. It was just a very powerful moment. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about juvenile fines and fees. In this state, we make kids and their families pay for their own incarceration. So we have kids becoming adults with $5,000, $10,000 worth of debt. And we don't even let kids work until they're 15 or 16. But we have a lot of kids who have picked up their first fine, the set of fines and fees as early as 14. And then lastly, I wanted to say something really quick about cash bail. On any given day, we have 5,000 to 6,000 people in this state sitting in jail, not because they were convicted of any crime. They're sitting in jail simply because they did not have enough money for bail. That correlates powerfully to being convicted, because if you can get out, you can hire a lawyer and start building a defense. If you're sitting in jail, that doesn't happen. So I'll leave it there. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take those. This is just an overview of what I talked about before. The police accountability ranking really high, juvenile fines and fees. There was a mention of clemency there also. One last thing, I keep saying one last thing and then I keep adding something, but I thought it was interesting that there were so many respondents who were interested in police training. And John may remember this, but we had some police trainers come and speak in front of the governor's commission on racial justice. And the trainers themselves said, we cannot train our way out of this morass that we're in terms of law enforcement. The problem is much bigger. But that says to me that there's a recognition that we do need some reforms.
Do you remember what they said potentially the problems were?
It had to do with who they were hiring.
Yeah. You have a lot of people that come from the military and they have that military mindset. And then they go into law enforcement. And so there's a combination of personalities and structured, and again, systemic racism within the organizations all across the country.
That's a good point, John. I probably should have made that point. We're in an era now of the warrior cop, to your point about the militarization of police officers. There's a wonderful book called The Rise of the Warrior Cop, and it talks about how our police have become more and more militarized. Some departments in the state of Kansas actually have military grade equipment. They have tanks and things like that that were military surplus that were, either given to local police departments or given to them at great discount. So that should be something top of mind for everyone. But thank you, Stacey.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think we'll back up just one quick second. Because to a lot of the things that we've talked about, be it housing, be it Medicaid expansion, be it criminal justice reform, these things, because there was a question in the chat a while ago, this idea of, well, if we just get a lot of people to write letters to Ty Masterson directly, will that help? Now, on one hand, I would say yes, because I think one of the things that I personally take as something I really want to always encourage is that we as a community need to get involved with the legislators and to write them and to show up in Black Legislative Day and to make our voices be heard. And so I think it is never bad to flood a legislator's inbox with, this is what's important to our community. So if would it help? I don't know if it would actually help, but I know it wouldn't hurt. Does it help in a very real way? I think, and we'll talk about this later, I think we need to have more people voting and choosing different legislators. That's just to be blunt. But, to this question of, should we just write letters? Yes, write letters, but also, and I think this will lead into what Donovan's going to talk about with voting. Yes, write letters. And so, yes. And so if we want, I think Donnavan is the next slide, Donnavan. Yes. So Donnavan from Loud Light, go ahead.
Noreen, can you actually go to the next slide on data, and then I'll circle back to this one, if that's cool. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that the results from this survey are particularly interesting and actually quite like give me some hope. So amongst the survey's respondents, we could see that the people who filled out the survey had a pretty good experience in getting registered to vote and support policies that make that process easier. We see that people support having more available early voting locations, protecting voter registration rolls, nonpartisan redistricting process, and the availability of external ballot drop boxes. And I think through these responses, what I could see is that the people who filled out this survey are pretty in tune with a lot of the conversations happening around voting, which is a good thing. I think if you're not educated on an issue, you're not aware that it's happening. And if you're not aware that it's happening, you're not aware of how you can affect change in regard to it. And I think the people who particularly filled out this survey are a very good group for doing that work of bringing other people in, making them aware, and getting them more engaged in the civic process, whether that's voting, whether that's contacting your legislator, whether that's going to a community event and learning about candidates. Okay, Stacey, can you go back to that last slide? So when I talk about voting, I kind of like to take a nuanced approach, because I think particularly in the Black community, we know two things. We know that Black people have a particularly hard time with voting, and we know the history behind it and the voter disenfranchisement and the racism. But then we also somehow always circle back to you need to vote, go out and vote. And I think without bringing both of those into the same conversation, we kind of do ourselves a disservice of like knowing that it's really hard and challenging, but also just like expecting everyone to do it. And that's something I think, particularly when I'm talking to Black people, I really like to center. So first, just like some of the things that I like to talk about are kind of the current landscape, and particularly in Kansas, kind of what we're up against. So in 2020, we redrew our state's maps, which pretty much are how voters are proportioned in the state to elect their elected officials, from Congress down to your state representatives. And one of the issues, I actually was a plaintiff on this lawsuit, was that with the maps which were drawn by Republicans, there seemed to be a conservative effort to dilute the power of the voting power of Black and brown people. That is just one example of instances of voter disenfranchisement at the hands of your elected officials. I know out in Southwest Kansas, there have been lawsuits around a primarily Latino community not having the voting power to elect a member of their community due to how district lines and stuff were drawn. For the past 4 years, I would say, especially since 2020, with all of the election conspiracy around that election, there has been a major push within our state to introduce voter disenfranchisement legislation to make it harder for everyone to vote. That is banning drop boxes. That is removing the 3-day grace period. So if you mail in your ballot, there's a little bit of a grace because mail can be slow, removing things like that. And just a lot of awful bills that really want to kind of muck up the waters in regards to how we vote, means that we can do to do that. And also, a lot of this is coming before major elections. We had the midterms. We're coming up again on another presidential election. So that is another very big thing that we are up against. Thankfully, voting rights advocates in the state have done a pretty good job at blocking a lot of these bills. I know KBLC, KAAAC, ACLU all do amazing work around that. Another one are education and institutional barriers. I have been doing voting rights work for several years, and I learn something new every day. So I think especially educating people, not just saying go vote, but hey, here's a website that you can go to that lays things out well. Here's the documentation you might need to register to vote, things like that, and realizing that going to vote is not just, you know, checking a box and signing your name. There's a process, and that process is, I would say, pretty difficult. And then one of the biggest threats that particularly concerns me, and Stacey was kind of touching on, is there are a lack of diverse perspectives in the rooms where these bills are happening, where the decisions are being made. And I think particularly in response to the Black community, when you aren't present and advocating for the needs of your community, they are nowhere near what the final product will be around. So for example, one of the big conversations that I particularly care about in the voting space is voting from jail programs. Mark kind of talked about how there are a lot of people in jail who have not been charged with a crime, who are essentially just being held there. And I think for the Black and brown community, a lot of those people look like us. So how does that impact them being able to vote? Because they haven't been charged and aren't felons and haven't received a sentence to block them from being able to exercise that right. But how many people in our state are being affected by that issue? Kind of zooming out for that, I think the Black community is particularly interesting because a lot of our voting demographics differ from other demographics. Black voters tend to be younger, where in a lot of generations they are older. I think that's particularly because voting is a learned behavior, and the further and further back you go, those people did not grow up having access to voting or being able to vote. So that's something that the newer generation is growing into, which I think is particularly awesome. Black voters also tend to be women. Shout out to Black women. You guys are constantly raising the bar for us Black men. And I think that's really cool. And there's a lot more data, but something that's particularly frustrating is that especially in regards to the nitty-gritty details of demographics outside of Hispanic, Black, there's not a lot of data that actually goes into the communities and dissects kind of the intricacies, which is why I think the survey that KBLC did is particularly helpful, because without data, it's kind of hard to connect the dots in a lot of instances. And a question I want to leave you guys with, and I'm sure I've talked too much, so we might not get to dive into it, is how do we engage Black people who aren't voting and who aren't the type of people to come to an event like this? Because I think, as the results saw, the people on this call are probably registered to vote. They are voting, but how can we bring other Black people in to make sure that that number is always growing and that our voices are being heard, and that we're gaining the political power to flip seats and make sure medical marijuana gets legalized, and that the policy outcomes we want to see are actually realized.
So there's one question that came in about voting, and I didn't know if you knew or if anyone on the call would know. I don't know if the ACL has done work on this idea of people who are formerly incarcerated. I know there is a big push to educate people who, if they're off papers, that their voting rights have been restored. So is there a way to track whether people are starting voting again, or just that effort to inform the public, if you're off papers, that you can still vote?
I will let Mark dive probably into like what the ACLU has been working on. But I don't think that there's anything being collected that isn't voluntary. I think a particular group would have to be polling that particular population, which I assume would be a feat, having done some like work with like polling and that kind of things. But I think that'd be really good to look out, especially in support of programs that restore rights and things like that.
That was a pretty thorough overview that we got from Donnavan. The only thing I would add is that there are tens of thousands of Kansans who may not be aware that now that they've finished their obligation to the state, they can actually vote. I've actually talked to people who've indicated that getting their voting rights restored was a difficult process. One gentleman I spoke to in Manhattan said it took about 2.5 years to get his voting rights reinstated, and that each time he got a form letter that had a kind of a threat at the bottom that said, you know, if you are a felon, you can't vote, which is incorrect. But he felt like that was put there to intimidate people from even trying to vote, even exploring the idea of voting for fear of staying enmeshed in the system. So there is a move right now to find those folks, contact those folks, and let them know that if you have finished your obligation, you can in fact vote.
Right. And I think, wasn't it the ACLU is involved in doing some of that work?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Yes, definitely. Okay, we are closing down here. So, right. So there's a question in the chat about machines, the voting machines being open during election hours. And this is the type of legislation that that Donnavan was talking about. There's been much discussion about external voting boxes, trying to get rid of external voting drop boxes, or they have to be observed, or they have to be, inside a building, and the whole question of the 3-day grace period. Here's one thing that I will say, because in fact, a question came to me earlier through a different channel about what is the situation of voting law right now. I will say that all of the discussion, it's not going to impact the election this year, right? Donnavan, you can check me on this. If there's any changes that are going on, it will not impact the election in 2024. So the 3-day grace period, if it goes away, it's not away now, right?
That is correct.
Right.
And especially just because like ballots have to be printed ahead of time. Rules and regulations have to be outlined. And I don't think anything that the legislature passes goes into effect before July 1st.
Right.
Somewhere in there. So way too close to the election.
So so nothing is changing in voting laws this year. Now, the question specifically about Wyandotte County, our counties control the elections. So the state legislature honestly doesn't control the election. So you'd have to take it up with the Wyandotte County election office. And each county has its own election office, and they sort of control the election at that local level. So,
and on that note, something to note that the 5 most populous counties in the state, I believe it's 5, they do not elect their election commissioner. It is appointed by the Secretary of State. So doing voting rights work in all of those areas, a lot of the work to expand voting rights in those issues is usually being stopped by a person who is not directly elected by the people.
It's the top 4. Douglas County directly elects their, once you hit a certain population point is now it's elected, it's appointed by the Secretary of State, but Douglas County is the 5th largest county. And we directly elect our Jamie Shue.
Cool. All right. Next slide. There were additional priorities, and it's really just a matter of time. You can tell here we're at 6:50 already, and there's so many questions around all of these things. There were a lot of issues that were important. So I'm not trying to say that there's nothing else that's important to the Black community. We just didn't have time to get it all done. I suppose our next step would be to try to compile all this information in some sort of print form and then email it out. But we wanted to get at least these results in this format to tell people what the results were. So next slide. In terms of our next steps, like a call to action, like what do? We've had Black Legislative Day, the legislative session is going on. We've had this webinar. So one of the things that we as KBLC with KAAAC and the Community Voice have decided to do is to continue these leadership brunches. That's just what we're calling them, these leadership brunches, for lack of a better phrase. You can see that there's going to be 5 of them, 1 a month starting in June. So the one in June is in Lawrence, July, Wichita, August, Kansas City, September, Manhattan, and October in Topeka. These leadership brunches are really with the goal of encouraging civic engagement amongst the African-American community. We will have a keynote speaker at each of them. Kay Monk Morgan, who is the CEO of the Kansas Leadership Center in Wichita, will come and talk about leadership in general at all 5 events. And then depending on people's speaker availability, one of the things we're also going to focus on is boards and commissions. Like, for example, John Nave and Mark McCormick talked about being appointed to the Commission on Racial Justice, or honestly, my position is appointed. There are literally hundreds of positions. There is a what is it? It's Kansas CPOST, Commission of Peace Officer Training. Like the board that oversees police officer training is an appointed board. So there are a lot of boards and commissions that deal with things that are more political. There's the cosmetology board. Like there's literally hundreds of positions. And just like having Black voices write our legislators, it's important to have Black voices in all of these board positions. They may not specifically be racially focused boards, right? But just having a diversity of people on these boards, taking parts of these conversations, setting policies for any number of situations around the state. So I know we will talk a lot about boards. I know we will talk about economic development, because we know that Black people start businesses. And so there's lots of resources available through the Department of Commerce or through other entities that people will come. I know we'll have Taylor Overton with the Women and Minority Business Affairs. And then on some of them, I think we might get David Tolan to come just to talk about what Commerce is doing to help Black entrepreneurs around the state. So sort of like watch this space. We will talk about that. And then always talking about the call to action to make sure that we're paying attention to our legislators and getting involved any way that we can. Voting obviously is very key. And I always say that politicians pay attention to the people who pay attention to them. Yes, it would be nice to have a representative on the State Board of Education. There are people who are running. I will tell you honestly, KBLC is a 501c3, so we cannot endorse a specific candidate. We can talk about the importance of voting. I can tell you it's important to know who's running for different seats and make sure you make a plan to get out to vote. Okay, if there's anyone else who wants to say anything, well, I just sort of scroll back through the chat. We still have like 6 minutes left.
I'd like to say something. I think Donovan's questions was, what is it going to take to get some of these people who aren't voting? And I think that's a really important issue. I mean, because I think we continue to keep speaking to the choir. But I think it has to be what's important to them, and we have to find things and communicate them in a way that they feel it's important enough to show up and vote. And so, I'm not 100% what that is, but I do want to. And again, guys, I tell everybody, I'm not that. I'm always the one speaking on marijuana, but the only reason I really am on this marijuana issue is because of I just cannot. The war on drugs, and we need to make we need to be some of the money made off of it, but. I worked with a group about 15 years ago around decriminalizing marijuana in Wichita. And I have never seen our community more excited about anything than that. And I tell you, we would post on Facebook, we did a petition drive to get this issue on the ballot. And if we said we were at the corner of 13th and Grove on Facebook, in 10 minutes, we would have 50 people show up to sign a petition. I mean, it's an issue. They're excited. I'm just saying maybe, with a state that still doesn't have it, maybe this is something that we can pull our people in on, that finally, because again, our community hasn't talked about it. Maybe if we make this an active issue of our community to talk about it and pull people, they might be interested. That's just one thing that I think a lot of, again, I know we're all up here, but everybody isn't up here with us. We're still just down here on the basics. And I might just like to smoke. I might want to be able to get some marijuana. And you'll reach some people that we aren't reaching. I'm just saying. I know they get tired of me talking about this marijuana.
I think John's trying to say something. But you're muted yet, John.
Well,
there we go.
one thing that Bonita touched on earlier was that, this push for legislation and what they're focusing on is medical, is that we have to be really visual about how they're going to proceed, because one thing that they will do is they will push these elected officials in the state of Kansas will push these out-of-state, multi-state operators into Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
That pushes the small businessman out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing they're going to be trying to do as the days ahead, if and when that comes to a fruition in the state of Kansas, And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'll just-
There's detail. The devil's always in the details with that.
right.
The devil is always in the details. Okay. Noreen, if you could stop sharing the screen. So in our final moments, I do want to take a last minute just to thank everyone who came, who is out in the audience and submitted lots of questions. We got to as many questions as we could. Then I also want to take another opportunity just to thank the panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, your wisdom, the fact that you know about these different issues. And I really want to just, this is just, it's been a joy to do this. For everyone, I do want to encourage everyone to sort of pay attention to KBLC's Facebook. We have a Facebook, we have the website, and there'll be lots of information going out about the legislative brunches. I know KAAAC, we will also put out information about the legislative brunches. I know the Community Voice will also put out information about the legislative brunches. All of us are invested in this. And so we hope to really expand our audience. That was one of the things with these brunches. We're trying to get at least 100 people at each brunch. So just to have more conversation organically about all the ways that we as a community can get involved and really help shape our future. Once more, I want to thank everyone. Oh, here we go. In the chat, you can sign up for information at KBLC. There's the website. You can check us out on Facebook. Follow us on, like, share, subscribe, comment, all those things to make sure that you stay up on what's going on. And thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice night.